Welcome to Momentum for Change, Voices of the Missouri Movement. This is a monthly podcast produced by your coalition, and I am your host, Nora Mosby, a member services specialist at the Missouri Coalition Against Domestic and Sexual Violence. We hope that you enjoyed this conversation coming to you directly from Voices of the Missouri Movement. Some episodes of Momentum for Change have conversations that include content and descriptions of domestic and sexual violence, which may be alarming or activating for some listeners. Please take care and visit the MOCADSV website or call our office to connect with supportive services. This is your host, Nora Mosby, and I'd like to welcome you to a new episode of Momentum for Change. I am very excited about our episode today. Fran S. Danis, PhD, has written two compelling and important history books called Origin Stories from the Movements to End Domestic Violence. This is a 2-volume series that highlights the unique narratives and pioneering work of survivors, activists, and researchers who, beginning in the 1970s, have engaged in impactful efforts to support survivors, ensure accountability, and address the root causes of violence. Fran tells the stories of these individual changemakers, collective actions, and also explains significant events and developments that have brought about lasting social change. Fran is here today to discuss what inspired her to write these books, the process that she went through to collect and compile these origin stories. And she's also going to share some riveting insights on the history of how our movement has gotten to where we are today. Fran, it is such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here with you and to share these stories because I think they're very inspiring.
I could not agree more. And these movements to end domestic violence are something that you have lots of experience with. You began working in this movement, like 50 years ago? So as we're getting started, before we even talk about the books, I just want to shine a light on you and talk about you for a second. How did you get involved in the movement, and what has kind of been your history of involvement over the years?
Okay. Well, thank you for that question. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I went to high school in the late 60s and was very much influenced by the civil rights, the anti-war. And then when I got into college, it was very easy to get involved in the new second wave of the feminist movement. And I graduated with a master's in social work in 1976. And I must tell you that in 1976, there was no coursework about domestic violence. We had little discussion about sexual assault. There were whispers that there might be a thing called child sexual assault. But it had not made its way into the classroom. There were no readings, there was no discussion, except when we sort of got together on our own to talk about things and our lives. I moved to Texas in 1976, the end of 76, and in 1980 found myself as the first founding executive director of Denton County Friends of the Family, which, if you know where Denton is, it's on I-35. It is at the apex of the triangle of Dallas and Fort Worth. And it has two universities, Texas Women's University and the University of North Texas. When I got involved, it was a dream of mine to do something, practice feminist social work, do something for women. That was what I really wanted to do. And I was able to take the position. I was the only staff person for a 24/7 program and hotline. I had two lovely volunteers who are still best buddies of mine today. We had no state funding, no federal funding. We restraining orders weren't worth the paper that they were printed on. There were no protective orders at the time. Marital rape was legal in most states. The police didn't want to be involved. The DA said, well, without a police report, there's nothing to prosecute. So they weren't going to be involved as well. And we had no idea how many women needed help. All we knew is that the phones kept ringing and the women and children kept coming. But we had no idea what we had no idea what we were doing, but we can talk about that.
Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around running a 24/7 shelter
Mhm.
without funding. Like, where were you getting support from
We
in the
got
early days?
$10,000 from the city of Denton. The county commissioners turned us down. In fact, one of the county commissioners sent out a rumor that we really were running a prostitution ring
Oh,
from the shelter
really?
because
Tell me more about that.
he couldn't understand how those women could share a bathroom. His 3 daughters couldn't even share a bathroom together. So there must be something bad going on in that shelter. So, and we did our best to try to recruit as many volunteers to help with what we were doing. So,
Wow.
and having the 2 universities, I had a ready pool of volunteers. I didn't always have the best money available, but I had we had all those volunteers.
So it sounds like there's definitely this legacy within advocacy of being creative and resourceful that really our founders kind of kicked off for us. And I feel like those values have continued today. So you're running the shelter without much funding, without much legal support from law enforcement, but you did have support from the community. So, kind of, where did you go from there?
Well, from there, I knew that I needed to have some help. I needed support. I needed to understand how other shelters and other programs across Texas were coping
Hmm.
with these beginning days, because everything we were doing was brand new. We had no manuals. We had no road maps. We were making it up as we went along. And so I heard about a group of other shelter directors that had been meeting, in fact, and so I got involved in what became the Texas Council on Family Violence, the state coalition. We wanted to be the Texas Commission on Family Violence, but we were told that only the legislature could create a commission. We wanted to give ourselves a very lofty. So that's why we're the Texas Council on Family Violence as opposed to the Texas Coalition. I wound up being on the board for 6 years, 5 of which was as the chair. And so I was there when we got our first funding. We opened our first offices. And we were able to do that because people like Debbie Tucker, who was our co-executive director at the time. Well, she was actually the director of the Center for Battered Women in Austin, their original name. And she, being in Austin, the point person, helped get funding for the shelter so that we could then expand our services. And so we went from one person to 11 people in about a 4-year period because we were able to do that. So that speaks to the power of coalitions. Um,
And what was kind of the goal of the coalition? Because I imagine that if there weren't shelters in the early days of the movement, there certainly weren't coalitions. And so, as you were getting the ball rolling on establishing statewide coalitions, what were you hoping to achieve with that?
Well, we wanted to support local communities with training and technical assistance. So we wanted to do that. We wanted to look at the common issues that we had across the state that were state problems, state issues, and be able to address those issues at the state level. So we needed a united voice that
Interesting.
amplified what we were doing. And we were quite effective in getting that first enabling legislation passed and having money in the budget to support the new shelter programs and domestic violence programs. We also were in that. We also wanted to make sure there were some standards because we had heard about shelters being opened with people who, I can't say they didn't have any experience because we didn't have any experience either. But they're I would just say questionable. They were looking at it as a way to get some state money as opposed to a way to, provide services to survivors. So we had some, uh standards put in there, and we also had a little bit of money, like 11% of the total budget went for statewide projects, so they were able to fund statewide research, about this issue, and that gave
Interesting.
us yes, that gave us one of our first, projects that looked at incidents in Texas. Uh
So, as you're talking about kind of building a shelter and providing services where there were none, building a coalition and creating a unified front where there wasn't one before, I can see that there's this kind of cumulative um, developments that are happening over time, even though it's just a short amount of time at that point. But you must have seen the benefits of these services. You must have seen the benefits of coalition work. So, in the early days, what was that impact you were hearing from survivors or from agencies as you were doing this movement building work?
well, first of all, they felt that they were being heard and seen. So this was the first time people didn't say to them, "What did you do to deserve this?" Okay. You've made your bed, go lie in it. We were saying, "Come here. We understand. We know you've been through a lot. We've got a place for you." So the creation of safe places for women to come with their children, because lots of other communities and other emergency services and housing in other places did not well, first of all, there weren't beds for women and certainly not beds for women and their children. So that was really important for us
Yeah.
and for them.
Right. So you just wanted to keep building on that success of first we established survivor safety, and then what can we do to change the conditions that are causing violence to happen in the first place? And we're so thankful that you continued with it because in 50 years, I would say the movement has achieved quite a bit of change. It might not feel like it every day, but as we look back to those early days and just 5 decades, that is a lot of change. Before we get to that, though, do want to say thank you for your leadership at the Texas Coalition. Where did your career go after that?
Well, it was clear to me I wanted to be in Austin, Texas, and I was after 4.5, almost 5 years on that front lines in Denton. This was before we had learned about, we're told that working in shelters could take on the workers, the advocates as well. And so it was time for me to make a change. And so I moved down to Austin. I wound up as the associate director for the Center for Social Work Research at the University of Texas at Austin. And all of my friends in the movement in the Austin area, the Texas Council, um, folks over at Safe Place with their 5th grade primary prevention project, Expect Respect, started coming to me and saying, "Oh, somebody, a researcher who understands what we're talking about here." And I said, "Well, I'm a staff person, but I'll try to find a faculty member that can serve as the primary investigator because those were the rules in academia." And finally, I decided that perhaps I needed to go back to school and get my doctorate so I could do this work and stop running around trying to find other people to do it who didn't understand it, didn't have the background. And so that's how I got my doctorate in social work and decided that this was the way I could continue to work in the movement and to support the movement by doing research and evaluation that would be helpful.
And I can imagine the impact you had going, kind of scaling out and being able to do research as somebody who had that direct kind of on the ground experience working with survivors, working in shelter, knowing what it means to build a shelter program, to build services, to build policies that will have a positive impact on survivors, and to use all of that to support research and also to support your students who probably also went on to provide direct services or do research.
Yes, and I have to tell you that my first academic appointment was at the University of Missouri. Oh.
Hey.
Uh, I spent 8 years in Mizzou, and they were very supportive of me, let me teach my contemporary issues of domestic violence class, every semester. And I had undergraduates, graduate students, not just social workers. I had a lot of psychology students. I had law students. I had nursing students. I had those students who were just interested because it was an important topic. You know, I had a biology major. It didn't matter to me because I felt like that course gave people life skills. It didn't
Yeah.
matter to me if they practiced in the field or not. They might need these to know this information, just by having sisters and cousins and neighbors and coworkers that may come to them one day and say, "Hey, I'm having this tough time."
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was somebody who started working in the movement when I was maybe 20, 21 years old, and have really feel like I have grown up learning from survivors, learning from my coworkers, fellow advocates, and I really can appreciate all of the life skills that this movement has really taught me. So I'm so glad that you were one of those teachers along the ways. So we're here today to talk about these incredible books that you have just recently written and had published, Origin Stories, from Movements to End Domestic Violence, Volume 1 and Volume 2. I cannot wait to get into it with you. I found these books to be just riveting. I thought they were page turners. I could not put them down. And so I'm just really excited to hear kind of your story of how you came to write them. What is the origin story of these books that
Origin.
that you wrote? Where did this idea come from? How did you decide to give it a go?
Thank you for your feedback on the books. It's always nice to hear from readers that they, really enjoyed it. It was easy to read and was accessible and so forth. That's really what I wanted to do, and it made sense to you. That's who I really one of my biggest audiences was writing for people who are doing this work and involved in it today. So I appreciate that your feedback. I didn't want to write these books. I fought against it for at least 2 years. I had a colleague, Judy Postmus, who is now the dean at the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland. I've known her for many years, and she came up to me and said, "You really need to write the history of the battered women's movement books." And I went, "Me? Why? That's too big an issue. Nobody has written anything. There's been nothing published on the history since 1982, and Susan Schechter wrote Women and Male Violence, The Visions and Struggles of the Battered Women's Movement. No one has attempted to get a handle on it. It has grown so exponentially. We have moved into all of these different institutions. Not only have we made changes within mental health and healthcare and criminal justice and so forth, but we have people who were working in those fields who have expertise in the movement as well, in this issue as well. And so uh, I'm like, ha ha, it's too big. So I spent 2 years trying to talk myself out of it. And she said to me, "You were there, your background, it's time, you have a unique perspective on it. Besides, you're retired and you have time to do it. We don't have time to do it." So I kept going back to Susan Schechter's book. And I looked at her preface. Why did she write this book? In 1982, we were just getting started. And she
Yeah.
said that she wrote this book because Ronald Reagan had been elected president. And everyone was terrified that we were going to lose funding and programs would have to close. And
Mhm.
she saw her book as a way to jumpstart the movement when we got restored funding and so forth. And so I looked at that and I said, well, she was worried about Reagan. What's my excuse about Trump?
Yeah.
And so I decided I needed to step up and do it.
Well, I'm so glad that you did.
And it was a way for me. I started looking at it not as a huge, overwhelming task, but as a way to give back to the movement that enriched my life and my career.
Yeah.
And so I started looking at it from that perspective, and it became a lot more doable.
Yeah, I think during a time when it feels like there's so much that is not possible, taking a minute to reflect on the progress and the successes that we have had over the last 50 years can help us focus on what is possible. Just knowing that so much has been achieved. Um, I think it inspires us to keep going. It inspires me to keep going, and just get excited about the future and hold on to some hope for positive change
Yeah,
when we see how much
absolutely.
has really happened in such a short amount of time. So I am just very grateful that you made the decision to write this book. And tell us about the process. Like, you really went for kind of this approach of origin stories, which I would say is maybe a bit not the way a traditional history is written. A traditional history might focus on milestones that have occurred over the years. And while you definitely talk about milestones of the movement, your approach to telling these stories is through focusing on individuals, and focusing on organizations. So tell us about that approach and why it was important to you.
Well, I've looked at many of the milestones that are out there, the timelines. You can Google them and find them and so forth. But it didn't capture what was really happening because it's a very linear process. And what we were seeing was things were happening exponentially in various different places. And at the same time, communities developed at their rates and differently. Some communities developed together at around the same time. Some came in later. Some came in earlier. Changes that happened in organizations were happening at different paces. And so I started looking at this as a kind of a mosaic and trying to say, well, I wanted it to be less about me and my perspective and my thoughts about it and more about the pioneers, the people who really did the work. I felt their voice was way more important and they were going to be able to provide a much richer description of what it was like to get this organization on the ground, off the ground, or create change in some other area. So I felt like that was probably more important for people to hear those voices. Just thought it'd be a whole lot easier, more accessible, and much more fun. It
Yes, it
certainly
certainly
is.
was fun. There's just amazing nuggets, these wonderful little stories that appear throughout the individual stories. But one thing I really enjoyed about the origin stories is that you could see how people and events were connected to each other. There were certain change makers that would appear in many different people's origin stories. There were certain events and efforts and organizations that would also appear in their origin stories. But one of the, I think, really powerful things about starting with how people got interested in the movement is that you could see what their motivations were. Some people were motivated by their own experiences of violence. Some
Mhm.
people were inspired by their parents' activism, and some people were and got involved because of, like yourself, other efforts for social change, such as the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, or the second wave feminist movement. And so to be able to see kind of where that inspiration came from is a rare glimpse into kind of where the roots of our movement are, I would say.
Yes, I would, absolutely agree with you. That's where the nuggets were. That was a fun thing. Um, I originally sent out, just some sort of general collecting origin stories, please send in and so forth, and I got a lot of stories that I got some first stories about the origins of individual shelters. And then I realized that I could not do a book that was just origin stories of shelters. Because there was the movement so much bigger than that. I
Yeah.
also gave people an opportunity um, to write their own stories and based on some guidelines. So when Ed Gondorf, for example, gave me his story, and I shared with him some other stories of some other people that he knew, and he said, "Oh, maybe I should have mentioned that I was a conscientious objector during Vietnam War." And I said, "Ed, here you are, one of the premier researchers that have been looking at the effectiveness of batterer intervention programs. How appropriate is it that you were a conscientious objector during Vietnam? Let's get that in there." So those are the kinds of things that were so exciting to discover with people.
Yeah. I agree. And what you ended up finding when people spoke to their own origin stories is that many people had the same origins, even though they ended up maybe doing different work, coming from different places, definitely had things that were not in common. But through their origin stories, you discovered that, in fact, they did have a lot in common, which was also really, really interesting.
We didn't grow up in a vacuum.
No,
Didn't
no,
grow up in
absolutely
a
not.
vacuum. Yeah, I think it was really important. We started out as more to the kind of format. I wanted to collect those survivor stories. This is the people who were overcame their own abusive experiences and said, "This is not going to happen. I don't want any other woman to go with that," and opened up and um, created agencies or got involved in law. But we wanted to get the survivors first, the local communities then, state coalitions, national organizations, allies, funders, primary prevention. And so I had to be a little bit more focused about collecting stories from people. And I wanted to tell, as they told their story, I wanted to put their perspective in a context. So, for example, talking to Jackie Campbell, who is the originator of the danger assessment form, who is a nurse, uh, a doctor nurse, researcher, and find out where she started from. And it was the death of she was a student, she was a school nurse, and one of the students that she worked with was killed in a domestic violence incident.
Hmm.
And she started also looking at teen dating violence. She wanted to find out what the number one cause of death was for young Black women, and she found out it was homicide. And she was
Hmm.
the first person to take a look at what, uh, who was killing who. We didn't really look at that before. It was just homicide. Nobody looked at the relationship between the perpetrator and the victim before.
Yeah.
So it was important when we started with Jackie's story to talk about intimate partner homicide. And I was able then to kind of work in silent witnesses and talk about how silent witnesses are present at many uh, conferences about domestic violence. and their connection with what she was doing in her work.
Interesting. Just if listeners aren't aware of the Silent Witnesses Project, can you, tell us a little bit about that?
Well, they are full length. Uh, s- what do you call them? They're
Like
not stacked
silhouettes?
silhouettes, yes, because there's no features, but they have a name and a date that they had been murdered by an intimate partner. And those are the ones that were there in their state. So they may have, if 13 women were murdered in your state in the past year, the next year you may have 13 silhouettes. And they are placed around the room so that people can be reminded about why we are here.
Yeah. That was one of the powerful things that stood out to me about your books is you could see that when there were these horrible domestic violence tragedies, oftentimes it was a call to action, and you saw increased public awareness around it. You saw increased public policies being developed afterwards, and you also saw people taking action to support survivors. And it was almost like a call, like these horrible events were a call to action that did lead to positive social change so that these things couldn't happen again in the future. And to have those connections made were really important. So I'm glad you did
And
that.
you do see that in a number of different stories. Unfortunately, we, as a society, our American society has not put as much focus on prevention as we do on response. And so, unfortunately, it takes those kinds of incidents before we do something, uh,
Yeah.
about it. But yes, it is a theme that you see in various different programs around. I collected these stories over a 2.5 year period, and I started to panic about how long the book had been coming. I was going way over the word limit that my publisher had given me, and said to me early on, the more pages you have, the more expensive the book. And I wanted to keep the book as accessible as I possibly could. Uh, and I just decided at some point after a number of sleepless nights, months actually, I decided that I couldn't cut people's stories. I couldn't cut out a whole lot of stories. I really had to, and I just sort of willfully ignored their edicts and I submitted it. And the first thing they said was, "It's too long." And we went, "Yeah, I know." Um, and then they were the ones who suggested that we split it into two different books, and have one volume that focused on individuals, and I had survivors and other change makers, and then the other one had more macro stories about community-based services, state and national organizations, and state and national organizations, and so each book is relatively around the same size.
I'm so glad that you kept in what you did because I can imagine as you're collecting and compiling these stories, this is kind of a culmination of your life's work. These are people you have relationships with. Um, and I think their stories also reflect a lot of kind of your involvement in the anti-violence movements throughout your career. And so I wonder if there's like a preciousness where it's just like you can value almost every word and every little aspect of a story that how could you cut some of these? Like,
No, 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 and those that I did kinda not include because it just the context and the whatever didn't work. It was very painful to be able to do that and had to explain, and I was met with support for making those kinds of decisions. So, it was tough, and there are lots of well, we'll get into that later, but there are other people that I wished that I could have, and included and wish that some of these stories could have been even longer, and 'cause there were so much more, but I kind of had to focus in on a particular milestone in some ways, like, there are books about, for example, the Violence Against Women Act and how that came about and whether it's, what we've learned from it, but nobody had talked about the role of state coalitions in that. So we wanted to find that niche that nobody had talked about before.
So you definitely had your eye on stories that you felt needed to be told.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it was just what can I say? It was a pretty thrill for me to sit there one-on-one in a Zoom conversation and talk to people about their work. People like, get an hour of uninterrupted time with the Jackie Campbell, for example, or at Esther Solar. Um, Pretty amazing for me. Uh, and what I did though is I had a simultaneous translation going on during our Zoom through Otter AI. Within 15 minutes of the end of the call, I had a transcript. I took that transcript, cut and paste, moved things around, got everything in order, and sent it back to the person for their review and comment. Wanted to make sure that I was accurate, that I got things correctly, and that I included things that they felt were important. So that was part of that process, that fact checking that was really important to do.
Wow. So there was the element of collecting the stories and
Yes.
then writing each story, confirming it with the author, but then also compiling the stories. So you mentioned that in volume 1, you really focused on individual stories, and volume 2 is macro level stories. Is there anything else you would like to say about compiling and that process, what that looks like for you?
Well, again, I wanted to make sure that I was being as inclusive as possible. So I had lists that I worked with and, here's a possibility here, I reached out to these people. I haven't heard back. I reached out to those. We've got interviews scheduled. Uh, who's not on this? What story needs to be told? I wanted to make sure that we had stories about criminalized survivors and approach that in a couple of different ways. So I had to look up who's doing the work here,
Yeah. Yeah.
and contact them and see what they were, uh, if they were willing to talk about how these organizations got going. A lot of people have been very much interested in the whole idea of transformative justice.
Mhm.
And so I wanted to make sure that I could reach out to Mimi Kim, who's been doing a lot of work on that, and get her time. And we had a when we could finally find a time in her schedule, we had a wonderful time together talking about her hopes and dreams and philosophy and how she got to the place that she is, because she's done a lot about criminalized survivors and a lot about the criminalization of the domestic violence movement. So she's quite the authority in those areas. I also did a previous book on cultural competency in working in the domestic violence field, and so I had a lot of contacts from that book that helped me again with the targeting of trying to find people to tell the story. So we
Yeah. That's something I really appreciated about the book is that because you didn't focus on milestones, it wasn't like we started at point A and got to point B. There's a chronology to the movement and how you tell these stories, but by focusing on kind of origin stories, you really can capture those elements of intersectionality and how so many different things were happening within these movements for social change, including addressing all these different elements of um, what was important to survivors and what was important to serving survivors, including immigrant survivors, survivors with disabilities, all these different intersections of the movement that people were addressing. You were able to weave into your story of the movement by focusing on the people that were doing it.
Yeah, I mean, that was exciting finding those folks to do that, was really an exciting, and they were thrilled too. They were pleased to be recognized for their work in the field and that those issues would be included in these books.
You mentioned Edward Gondoff earlier, and he's one of the founding members of Raven, which is the Batters Intervention Program that was founded here in Missouri. And as somebody who's been active in the Missouri movement for many years, I really uh, loved that there was so much of the Missouri movement that shined through in your stories. And so Raven was mentioned. You mentioned the former MOCADSV CEO Colleen Coble a number of times when you talked about BAWA and order of protection law. And you also mentioned some of our current members. Big shout out to Lisa Fleming for her story, Lisa Fleming from Rosebrooks, and Teresa Price from Agape House. So there was just these elements that kept showing up in Missouri. What would you say about the Missouri movement and some of the change makers that you highlighted in your history here?
Well, we're talking about passionate, dedicated people who are savvy enough to get things done. Colleen, amazing work at the Texas legislature for many, many years. I have to give a shout out to her for she spent 2 hours on the phone with me when I was just a candidate and considering taking the position at the University of Missouri, telling me why I needed to come here. And so she, she could be quite persuasive at times.
I'm aware of that, yes.
Yes, yes, and of course her work of just let me expanding a little bit. Her work comes up in two places, in two stories. In the story with Debbie Tucker and Vicki Smith talking about the role of the state coalitions. She was at the pivotal meetings where a bunch of state coalition members came together and said we need to do something about a presence at the federal level. And they created an organization called Domestic Violence Coalition on Public Policy, or they call it DV COP. And they went in once a month. They were going to Washington, D.C. They were going line by line, VAWA, and getting things done. And they each had some things they wanted to make sure were in the bill. One of those things was support for state coalitions. Very few state coalitions had a funded staff people and had offices that were open. A lot of them were run by volunteers who were running their own shelters and programs at the time. So it was hard to focus full time on the needs at the state level. Barbara Hart, in her story about protective orders, talks about how she heard from Colleen about the problems that women in Kansas City were having. And that if you were living in Kansas City, Missouri, and working in Kansas City, Kansas, your protective order may not be enforced in the section of town in which you were not officially residing. That's a Missouri problem. That's a Kansas problem. Debbie Tucker was saying the same thing about women in Texarkana, Texas, because they were right there on the border of Texas and Arkansas. So those kinds of things were stimulus for her. And she then figured out that the full faith and credit clause of the U.S. Constitution could be applied for protective orders.
Yeah. I had no idea that had its roots in the Missouri anti-violence movement.
Absolutely, absolutely. I want to give just a little shout out to Cheryl Robb Welch, too, because she introduced me to Tressa Price, who talked about the incredible challenges that she has with Agape House in Mountain View and being in a very rural, isolated area, and one in which the shelter has to be as a survivor, like the survivors that they help. they've also need resources and that they don't always have access to. But her story was really particularly fascinating for me as well because she wasn't the founder of Agape House, but the founder tapped her to work with her. And she said, I had no idea at the time why she handed me the keys and said, congratulations, you now have this job, until she realized that the founder knew that she too was a survivor. And she had that experience that she could then share and serve as a model and a support for other women. One of the things I say in some of the introductions is that you're going to find not just survivors in the first book, you're going to find them everywhere
Yes.
across both books. So that was really exciting to work with Tressa and get her story. I had been privileged to visit Rose Brooks while I was in Missouri, and I had heard about Pa's Place, and I wanted to make sure that the pets were included in this because it was definitely a challenge in keeping families together to say, you can't bring your dog, you can't. And the story of Jay Matthew, who basically saved his mom, his human mom, by placing himself between the batterer and her and taking all the blows, and she saying, no, I'm not going to send him to a shelter, and them saying, well, maybe we can, maybe this rule, we can, suspend it and see what happens. And now, of course, they have a therapy dog on site for everybody. I think that was such an inspiring story. I wanted to include it as well. But last but not least, I had hoped there'd be a lot more stories about state coalitions and their work.
Mm-hmm.
And when I sent out the general call, whatever, Jennifer Carter Dultford, former policy person
She's our former policy director here.
Everything former everything.
Yeah.
For the Missouri Coalition, gave me a wonderful story about working with two survivors, helping change the protective order law with regards to the duration of a protective order. So instead of having to come every year and bring your stuff and tell you the story about why you're still in danger, she and these two survivors worked together, and with the backing of the coalition and the folks across the state, to change that from 1 year to a lifetime duration for protective orders. And that's a great, great story. And I incorporate that in my introduction to that section of the book, to give a shout out to her work and the work of a state coalition. So, sometimes you're accused of only writing about what you know, and I had to be really careful not to have a whole book of Missouri and Central Texas. I was like, well, maybe I can get somebody from Vermont here. And I really made a conscious effort to make sure that we got people from around, basically dispersed around the country.
Well, we really appreciate you shining a light on some of these developments that had origins in Missouri. So thank you for that. But as you're reflecting on the book, were there any other kind of stories that you were really happy that you got to tell or that you thought were really important to
Well,
highlight?
there's some new things that are happening in the book. I decided to title the book about movements to end domestic violence. And Debbie Tucker had a little help with my wordsmithing on that. When I first started, we called ourselves the Battered Women's Movement, and there was, of course, a lot of survivors who were working, and so they were, And over the course of several years, we all decided that nobody likes to be called a battered woman, and we had a more strengths-based perspective, and so we started talking about survivors. But lots of people still identify as being in the battered women's movement, and I could find nobody who could tell me the origin of it. So if anybody is listening and knows the origin of that term, let me know, because I've asked a whole bunch of folks. Even Barbara Hart couldn't figure it out. Debbie couldn't figure it out. No one
Interesting.
could. Yeah, it's very, very interesting about that. But I wanted to capture that it wasn't just we started in one place, but then we had so many, you know, other movements that came off of it. And there are two things that are going on now that were really very exciting. One is what Sonia Passy is doing in Free From in LA, looking specifically at economic abuse. And here's a survivor who, by the way, didn't become a survivor until after she was doing the work. She was already attuned and doing work as a legal activist in this field. Um, and then winds up in a domestic violence situation herself. And there are a couple of people in the book where that happens to. But what she's doing to look at state laws and policies and see how helpful they are or oppressive they are to women in the book who are in being financially abused, I think is very, very exciting right now. And then the other one, which is just a dear and wonderful synchronicity kind of a story, was Suzanne Post's story about Sharehaven. Uh, here is a Here's a hairdresser, a salon owner, was terribly abused. Her ex is deceased now, so she feels safe. There's a couple of people like Kit Gurrell, whose abusers are deceased now. They feel, oh, that's sometimes what it takes. And she wanted to make sure that other women didn't experience this. And she thought, well, gosh, people who work in salons have a really unique relationship with the people who come in to get their hair cut. They come in and maybe every 6 weeks or so, they have an ongoing relationship with them. They tend to tell people it's a safe space for women. And she partnered with the local Y and creating some training. And she wanted to get this across. She wanted a law requiring continuing education for people who worked in salons. And she started during COVID. She was trying to get a law passed in the Tennessee legislature because she comes out of Nashville, trying to get a law passed. COVID happens. Everything's shut down. She winds up being on a committee to advise the governor as to when they could reopen salons. And she winds up sitting next to a woman, and she tells her the story about what she's trying to do with the legislature. And she's saying, I'm supposed to get this. People want it online, and I have no idea of how to do things online, And this woman said, well, I can help you with that. She was the national director of education for Barbicide, which is the disinfection, that blue liquid stuff you see when you go to a salon. And she said, we have all this online training. And so
Yeah,
they created that platform, and now people are getting trained all over the world. And the thing about when you reach people who work in salons as well, you're also potentially working and reaching survivors.
absolutely.
And so
Yeah,
that was very, very, very exciting. So I was really, all of these stories are phenomenal stories, but
I know.
these are more recent ones.
Yeah.
And I just want to keep feeling like the movement continues.
I agree. I think that this is such a comprehensive um, storytelling of movements to end domestic violence that have happened over the last 50 years. And you bring such an insider's perspective to it. Like you talk about these huge policy changes like VAWA or the formation of NNEDV or NCADV. But then you also talk about all these other really important stories like survivors carrying a pager or survivors opening and running thrift stores, like really important elements of the movement. And these all are just important aspects of these histories. And so I love the perspective that you bring to it. And people's voices, these collective voices really shine through, which I think reflects a lot of the diversity and some of the dynamics of working in a movement is that you have people coming together. Sometimes they have these common origin stories, sometimes not, and they have these different perspectives, but all together, there's so much power in leveraging change.
Absolutely.
So I really do want to talk about what are some key takeaways that you would like readers to leave these two important volumes of history with? Like, what are the takeaways from these books?
I have 5 words. I've got it down to 5 words: connection, recognition, celebration, persistence, and resiliency. We need to connect with the people who have done the work, the folks who have come before us, with those original pioneers. We got to do it before they're not there anymore. And we have plenty of folks who are not there anymore. No Susan Schechter, no Ellen Pence, no Tilly Black Bear, no Evan Stark. All of these people are really important for us to connect with. We want to recognize the work that they've done, where they started from, where they got us to. We want to celebrate that we have come so far. You know, we spend a lot of time just peeling back the onion and saying, okay, well, we got that one. Now here's the next thing we have to deal with. And it's so hard sometimes to really see the big picture and see what we really have accomplished. And so that becomes very, very important. And we need to celebrate that. There's not enough celebration here. Um, we did have a good time here at times. We have to understand that it's our persistence. We keep knocking on these doors. We can't give up now. There's more to be done. Always more to be done. And we need to approach this with the persistence and the passion that have uh, uh, came from our foremothers and fathers in the movement. And then we need to take that time and recognize that our movement, as well as individuals, our movement is resilient as well.
Mm, yeah.
Yes, we've been knocked down before. We will come back up again. We may be knocked down in the future. I know we're all working on eggshells, and I feel that. For everybody, particularly those who are doing direct services, we've lost so many people and so much um, expertise that we could have had at the federal level. Lynn Rosenthal, for example, in her job as the director of sexual and gender-based violence for the Department of Health and Human Services, bringing in all those agencies together and
Hmm.
coming out, finding solutions. We've lost that. But we can get that back because we now know a little bit about how to get there. And so
Yes.
we've got to take a look at our own resilience. And so, like the survivors, we have to be resilient and persistent as well. But we need to take the time to connect and to recognize and to celebrate.
I love those takeaways. They're such 5 important words that we could just talk at length for, but I just love that you identified what those 5 key takeaways are. It's so important. For other people who are interested in learning more about these takeaways, where can they find your book?
Well,
Or excuse me, your books.
my books, yes.
Yes.
I still refer to it as my book too. The books are available through Cognella. They are the publisher. They are a textbook publisher. It's very hard to do a trade book and collect all these stories. I really couldn't do it. Trade books want, publishers want a finished product. They want me to have a literary agent, all that kind of stuff, which is not happening here. So we went with Cognella. I appreciate you'll provide them with there's a 20% voucher if you get both books together from Cognella. They are also available on Amazon. And they are also available through Bookwoman, which is a feminist bookstore in Austin, Texas. And I will be talking there on March 5th. We're having a little author talk at Bookwoman. So I'm very excited. I get to connect with my roots again. So it's always nice. You guys got in first. I'm going to tell them that.
Yes, and listeners, I will put the brochure with that coupon code in the show notes for this episode. I could not encourage you more to seek out these books. They're truly fantastic and very inspiring. So you've got this event coming up at Bookwoman. Is there any other events or anything you're looking forward to with the release of these books?
I'm excited to be back in St. Louis.
Yay!
I'm going to be real excited. It's a conference that is sponsored by Safe Connections. And I'm very honored to have been asked to keynote the conference. And so that is going to be on August 13th. And I'm going to look for opportunities to connect with my alumni, hopefully. Having done a number of different trainings for the Missouri Coalition when I was here. So there are a number of folks that I have met, sat in on some board meetings and so forth, and have always been a great champion of all the work that you've been doing. So that's a great one. And then I'll be speaking at the Texas Council on Family Violence Conference in late October for DV Awareness Month.
That's wonderful. Well, we cannot wait to welcome you back to Missouri, Fran. We just covered 2 incredible volumes of history in a very short amount of time, spanning 50 years. As we're wrapping up this episode, are there any final thoughts, anything you wanted to be sure to speak to with our time together today?
I just want to thank you for inviting me and for reading the books and for giving me such insightful feedback. Your questions have been just really spot on and very, very helpful in talking about the book. We could go on for a long time. I see this book as a mosaic with many pieces missing still. And so what I hope is that other people take this up and decide to build upon the work that is here. I see it as a good starting place for other people to really delve more in depth in the history of this movement.
Yes, and I encourage movements, yes. And I encourage listeners to take you up on that challenge and to think about what are the opportunities that we can continue to fill in any kind of missing things within this mosaic, because there certainly are many opportunities to carry this torch forward and to keep impacting really significant change. So thank you for just inspiring us to keep doing this work, Fran.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us for this conversation. I cannot recommend these books more. They're just fantastic. Thank you for your time to write them. I learned so much. I am so inspired by them. So thank you for that, Fran.
Thank you so much for your feedback and for inviting me. I'm so excited to hear your how the books resonated with you.
Of course. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. We've really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and we look forward to bringing you more episodes of Momentum for Change throughout season 5 of the podcast. Thank you for joining us. This has been a recorded conversation now available in both video and podcast formats. A video recording of this episode is available on the MOCADSV YouTube channel under the Momentum for Change playlist. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel in order to receive new episodes in your YouTube feed. You can also find all of our Momentum for Change episodes available to stream on Spotify or wherever you find your podcasts. Momentum for Change is a podcast produced by MOCADSV with post-production support provided by Tim Stillings and promotion by Adrian Maddox. Again, I am your host, Nora Mosby, and we appreciate you joining us for this episode. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next month.